Thanks, Genevieve. And I'm very much looking forward to today's session, what I know will be both an informative and compelling conversation. International Women's Day is a global day, celebrating the social, economic, cultural, and political achievements of women. It also marks a call to action for accelerating progress on gender equality. The day grew out of a campaign for change in 1908, when 15,000 women marched through New York City, demanding shorter hours and better pay, as well as voting rights. In 1909, the first Women's Day was observed across the United States, and this movement spread in the years that followed to Austria, Denmark, Germany, Switzerland, and Russia, eventually officially designated International Women's Day by the United Nations in 1975. In Australia, it has become not only a day of celebration, but an opportunity to galvanise action for change. This year with a strong focus on sexual harassment in the workplace. With Australia ranked 44th on the Global Gender Index, a national gender pay gap of 13.4%, with 82 of the ASX 200 company boards with less than 30% women as board directors, and women retiring with 50% of the superannuation of men. There are plenty of reasons to act, and that's before we look at domestic violence. At Australians Investing in Women, our focus is on mobilizing philanthropy as a critical lever in achieving social change for women. By encouraging funders to apply a gender lens, we work to ensure the needs of women are made visible and are addressed. Gender-wise giving maximises the impact of philanthropic investments and empowers giving for a fairer future for everyone. This year, we have commissioned, we have commissioned Equity Economics to undertake research to provide a picture of how COVID-19 has impacted women in order to inform and guide philanthropy to the most effective investments that will support women and aid our economic and social recovery. The research will be launched at the end of the month with Philanthropy Australia. Please visit our website for details to discover how you can supercharge your giving and to learn about projects making a positive impact on women's lives. I'd like to thank ABL not only for inviting us to be a part of today's event, but for their generosity in providing us with pro bono legal advice from day one, when we were established as Australian Women Donors Network, and through to our recent rebrand of Australians Investing in Women. In particular, I'd like to thank Joey Borenstein and Bridget Cowling for their ongoing support. And I will now hand over to Teresa to begin the conversation.
Thanks very much, Jill, and thanks everyone for being here today. I echo my welcome to that which Jen and Jill have opened. We're pretty interested in the things that Catherine has to say, so we're going to dive straight into the series of questions that we thought would be useful to talk about today. The first question, or the first set of questions really that Catherine wanted to talk about this morning is COVID, given the theme for International Women's Day and the year that 2020 was for most of us, particularly those of us who are working parents and were locked down in Melbourne. 2020, it's fair to say, was a very challenging year all round. And it was a period during which our lives were on show. It was a period of enhanced evolution on the work front, where we had to all navigate, particularly those of us in Melbourne, the unclear divide between home and work, or the non-existence of a divide between home and work at times, particularly for working parents who were also homeschooling their children at the same time. And we had to learn to do things differently with a greater reliance on technology and a greater appreciation for the use that technology, or the benefit that technology could give to us. While I think that there are many silver linings in the fact that everyone's daily lives were on show, particularly for my own part, I've worked flexibly for many years, and it was nice for me to not be the only person who had children running around in the background. A lot of women, and me in particular, are asking whether COVID will be a catalyst for change, or it in fact might be an obstacle to it, given that everyone's struggles have been so very visible. So the first question that I wanted to ask is, what's your view on how COVID will affect working women's, the view of working women? And will the warts and all view that we've had of how working women and everybody else balance the competing demands of home and work lead to more acceptance of women's contribution to the workforce? Or is there a risk that it will actually entrench existing views?
Good to start with something very straightforward and easy succinctly. But before I even do that, can I thank ABL for having us today, and Jill for her great comments. And just to add that I'm on the board of Australians Investing in Women, because I believe very firmly, in fact, I feel like my entire career of decades of advocacy can be summed up by let's apply a gender lens. Let's apply it to everything we do, to our employment, our families, everything, because then we find out, in fact, that women and girls are often not as fairly treated as they should be. So that's just a very simple sort of introduction to what we do at AIIW. And also just to note, as Jill said, that IWD is not Mother's Day. And I just wanted to add that because there's quite a lot of slightly jaundiced views about IWD. Why are we celebrating this? Look at where we are. What we're doing is actually commemorating women, as Jill said, marching in the streets for low-income, low-paid workers who were so poorly off in 1908. It's hard for us even to imagine. So I love doing these discussions, and I think we should keep up the pressure and remind ourselves of what we're commemorating today and what we need to achieve. So the COVID question is an interesting one. About a year ago, a former editor that I worked with who's at The Australian asked me to write a piece on what COVID meant for the workplace. And a lot of people were saying, well, look, we have to see, obviously we're working from home, many of us for the first time. Possibly this will challenge and break down some of the resistance to flexibility for a start. It certainly has made some shifts, I think, much more viable. The number of people I spoke to who said, I'm never travelling to a work meeting in another city in Australia. It's ridiculous. Why did we ever do that? But my observation would be, as we are slowly coming out of what was kind of a blanket work from home regime, we're seeing very unequal outcomes for women. This should not surprise anyone who, like me, has pored over the data and evidence for years. So far from recalibrating the domestic division of labour, the latest ABS stats show us that women are now working 1 hour extra per day in unpaid labour. 1 hour extra. So men have also raised their contribution there, but at nowhere near the same level as women. So what that means is that even though those conditions have changed and so on, but the pressure was there, we've defaulted to very traditional stereotypes. Now, what concerns me, as we have a kind of hybrid model emerging, are we going to see women at a distinct disadvantage because they're disconnected from the workplace? So they will say, look, for a whole lot of completely valid reasons, I'm now feeling the pressure to probably work from home, continue to work from home for part of my working week. Their male partners may have more liberty to go back into the workplace. What does that say for women's prospects, for their tenure? And the other, of course, deeply worrying sign, and we've seen some wonderful research coming out about this, is the impact of the recession last year on women's workforce participation levels. That has dropped back. We know more women lost their jobs at the beginning of COVID, but while that kind of evened out in the end, what we do know is women detached from the workforce. And historically, and an economist can tell you, that detachment can often last for years. So that is a deeply concerning sort of mega trend.
Yeah, so it's the out of sight, out of mind aspect of it, yep. which is concerning. And I mean, it seems to me, as part of the sort of broader question, you rightly mentioned that International Women's Day is not Mother's Day, and it's not. It is a day to celebrate and reflect on how it is that we press for change and continue to press for change. And sort of more broadly, picking up some of those statistics that you mentioned, I was having a look at some of the Grattan Institute data and the McKinsey data, and there's a real concerning trend, I think, of women leaving the workforce. Beyond even that sort of perhaps unequal participation in the kind of traditional office workforce. If that's a trend which it's certainly not one that I think. It's certainly not one that is reflective of women not wishing to participate in the workforce, but simply that there are so many competing demands which have been really obvious during the last year, and choices have to be made. But if that is a trend which we're going to see at least for a year or two, possibly longer, how do we continue to drive and keep momentum up for long-term change in women's in gender equality, if in a sense the result of that is a contraction again in the number of women who are visible in the workforce and have a sort of a pipeline of future leaders, which there is something to be said for visibility being one of the factors which can drive change. How do we continue to maintain that momentum when at the moment people are sort of treading water and doing what they need to do to survive?
Well, I suppose, again, no simple answers. Visibility and value are the two V's. So making sure that we understand what women actually represent. Highly educated source of labour in this country, as we well know. So yes, we've dropped down on the Global Gender Gap Index. We used to be 15, we're 44. But we, of course, as you know, are ranked number 1 for education of women and girls. What are we doing here? Why are we educating our women and girls so brilliantly to almost discard them? And again, I would also suggest, and that's why I wrote a book called Stop Fixing Women, the issue here is not all about supply. I would say actually it's not about supply at all in some ways, it's about demand. So if we actually want to look at that, the leaky pipeline, someone recently, an engineer said to me, you know what? You've got a leaking pipeline, a water pipeline, you fix the leak and you don't blame the water. Yeah. And I think we haven't even started to look at identifying and fixing the leak. So, and by that I mean everything from childcare, access, affordable childcare, the tax regime, giving women genuine flexibility, the capacity to keep your superannuation savings going. There's so many macro areas, structural infrastructure, if you like. And then there's the whole sort of workplace shift, which, for many years I was sort of hopeful that we were kind of getting there. But in the last 4 years since the book came out, I think we've actually shifted backwards. So I think we've done very little. And organisations that tell me, and I think they actually believe it, we've tried everything. Well, actually, I see no evidence of that. I don't think there's an organisation in Australia that can say they've tried everything. I don't even think they've started on trying to actually address this. And then, of course, there's the whole issue, and again, economists can tell you much more succinctly than I can, but about reskilling women so that we don't have this terrible occupational segregation. We're one of the worst in the OECD. Over 50% of women employees in Australia are employed in 2 or 3 sectors. And we know that that's what's driven, for example, the gender pay gap, amongst many other unfair outcomes for women. So there's a whole lot of things we can do, and other countries in the world have done some of it. There's no country that's sort of, perfect, but there are lots of levers that we can pull that we haven't really started to do.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of the things I think that the last sort of 18 months to 2 years has exposed in all its raw honesty has been the fact that we did, and I agree with you, it's not just been the last 2 years, it's been over the last 4, possibly 5, that there has been a shift back to more conservative, traditional views of things, and COVID made that very clear. And it's a question of how we turn that around again now in a world which is quite
And
different.
Teresa, can I just add there, you're absolutely right, more conservative views. Very good Australian research has found that men in their 30s have much more conservative views than older men. So that's just to put that in perspective. I often hear, oh, a new generation of men are coming through. And of course, some of them will have very different views. We're talking in averages here. But University of Canberra did some very good research about 18 months ago and found that men in their 30s strongly believe that their career is a priority, that their partner should do the bulk of the domestic work and childcare. So I guess what we're saying here is this is not a sudden overnight issue prompted by COVID. This is actually that was already widely believed and adhered to.
Yes, yeah, I think that's very true, and 2020 certainly exposed some of those differences. I might just throw over to Jen because we've got some other questions. Conscious of time, we've got some other questions we'd love to ask too that delve into perhaps some of the more controversial current political issues. Jen, can I pass over to you?
What on earth would they be, Teresa?
Oh, I have no idea.
So, we talk about 2020 being a year like no other. I think the last, 2-3 weeks in Australian media and Australian political life have been weeks like no other. And, for those of you who have been under a rock, there's a maelstrom of serious allegations of rape and sexual misconduct that are hanging over our federal parliament and other big institutions within Australia. And whilst they've been shocking to people and deeply shocking to people, for many they haven't been that surprising. And in the case of political staffer Brittany Higgins and her former boss, that they cite reasons like personal privacy and right to choose as reasons for not advancing those claims up more formal channels. And in your book, Stop Fixing Women, which I just love the name, but you talk about demolishing and reconstructing the kind of gender-biased framework that underpins, what I'd say is federal parliament and the broader corporate world. And Ms. Higgins' complaint seems to go to the heart of that conundrum in many ways, and the people's reaction to it goes to the heart of that conundrum. So do you mind, Catherine, just sharing some insights on your thoughts on how we might resolve situations of where you've got, on the one hand, privacy and personal choice, which are so important as well, but when you look at them as being constrained via the kind of gender-biased framework that is still so unconscious to many?
Yes, of course. And I guess it's important to point out, yes, the word agency was being bandied around in discussions over the last few weeks, which I found, how can I put this, paradoxical? Because actually, what kind of choices do young women, and indeed women more generally, have in many of these environments? We should know by now that the even playing field is a myth. In all kinds of processes and in access to the right kinds of environments where you can have your point of view taken into account and then addressed, for heaven's sake. So the benefit of the doubt, belief in what women say. And I remember some years ago, Kate Jenkins, who I know quite well, we were discussing for the book I wrote after Stop Fixing Women called Womankind, which looked at the effects of the Me Too movement, amongst others. And Kate was saying one woman's voice is never believed. You have to have at least 4 women stepping up in a legal sense to kind of have any kind of momentum. What Me Too showed us was something quite fascinating. Didn't see it coming, but I think that's changed things quite profoundly. And the reason I mention all of that is because I think there is a legacy that Brittany Higgins and Grace Tame and other young women, and how impressive are these young women, are showing us they didn't get fair process. They did not access that. They were told it was their right, and I understand, because they understand, like all women do, what the ramifications are. when you raise complaints or even suggest that I feel like I wasn't getting a fair hearing there around the meeting table. Backlash is fierce and the penalties are real. How we go about sort of shifting that? Well, I'm watching with fascination what's going on at the moment. And one of the things I would suggest is that the Me Too movement really did rock the foundations of some of our institutions and our power structures. I was told when I was writing about this, about a year after Me Too had unleashed, that it would disappear. No, it hasn't. It has not disappeared. What's playing out in Canberra at the moment is a direct legacy of that movement. I think women are genuinely angry. I think women across a whole lot of demographic areas are very annoyed. And I think they're coming together next Monday to make a ring around Parliament House to show that that anger is there and it's real. I think that the only way that we can break down some of this is to actually use our collective clout. We do have it. We're nearly 51% of the Australian population. It just feels like we're treated as a minority. And I think that we are seeing something really important unravel. In terms of actually understanding how we shift those structures, which of course I've spent most of my life trying to kind of tease out, I've actually always thought that we should lead by example, show how organisations were actually altering things. But I think I've changed in the last year. I think we now need to be much firmer and actually call out organisations that continue to use lip service around something called diversity. We used to call it women's rights. I think we need to be much more specific about what we need to see. And seriously, the evidence is showing us the opposite. So I think we need to really call that out and do whatever any of us can do. I know it's harder when you're more junior and you don't feel like you've got a platform, but my goodness, as I say, look at what these young women are doing and coming together and seriously disturbing some of the people who have a very entitled and privileged idea of what power is in this country. The world is changing, but actually progress in these kinds of areas, social movements, is never smooth. And I think we're going through quite an interesting circuit breaker. So my hope is that we continue to see action coming from that. And in an organisational sense, we need more accountability. Organisations need to step up, show us what you're doing. If you can't show us how many women were promoted last year or weren't, then how on earth can you tell us you're a meritocracy and you've ticked the diversity box on your corporate social responsibility checklist? You can't. So I think it's time we held them to account.
I think there's also a growing trend, and this is broader than women's gender, but just, and I say this as a 40-something white female, where you become, I think the world is becoming a little bit more conscious of the innate privilege that you have and that there are things you just don't know or that you can't experience or that you haven't experienced, and therefore the way in which you're responding to a situation is one that is unconsciously biased or unconsciously privileged. And I think that concept, that framework and that mindset is one that is only healthy for a corporation and for individuals to enhance in themselves and to become more, to talk about more, because otherwise, in terms of how you respond to these situations as they come up, I think this last week has shown that, Canberra needs that, but we all need that.
Yeah, and of course that is a self-sustaining structure, isn't it? So we continue to appoint people who kind of look like us, who have cultural fit and so on. And look, we're very aware of this, and we also have terrific data in this country. We know that this stuff's happening. We also have wonderful data from our Workplace Gender Equality Agency showing us about a 6% bottom line increase when you have a more diverse management group. It's there. So we know all of this, but I used to think that, the penny will drop on some of this. It's logical and it's rational. And I now kind of say to myself, you've thought that for a long time and it hasn't actually happened. It happens in pockets, and I know there are organisations that have done some good work, but it's very much still scattered. It's not one sector. It's not, it just isn't consistent and it hasn't been sustained. And that's the other thing I'd observe where progress has been made at times. It's often a CEO who has a very enlightened and progressive attitude. And once they leave, there's a very quick default, often accompanied by someone saying, that's not a priority for me. And, you know, that's where we still are. So I think we need to be, you know, pragmatic about this. I am actually a bit of a believer in the name and shame regime. I think the statistics around the, you know, the number of boards that only will have far less than 30% women on them. And while we say the AIICD has done a great job, and they have, we were in 2009, I think something like 7% women on boards. So they're now over 30, close to 33% of ASX 200. Once you go across the All Ordinaries, it's much lower. And of course, it's often one, maybe two women. So a lot further to go, even in areas that have in fact made some inroads. But what worries me a lot is the lack of women around the decision-making table. I hesitate to use the word leadership because I always think it sounds like a corporate, you know, pyramid, and someone in stilettos, you know, with the briefcase and what have you. It's about having women who are making decisions, helping to make decisions around the table. And when that COVID commission was first set up, there were 2 women, I think, on it. And after a bit of an outcry, yes. But that's the default now. It's like, oh, we better put a woman. So we still haven't got anywhere near recognising the value that women bring to the table.
And the balance, and this is the quandary, the balance is naming and shaming, and then the value judgment, and I say that in a bad way, that comes from someone who fills a position after named and shamed, because you want it to be for merit and for the worth that they bring, and it's just establishing that. That's such a hard balance.
Well, show me the merit for every man who's been appointed to a board. And also our wonderful chair, Sam Mostyn, always says the same thing. I've been told year after year I was a token appointment. I was filling a quota, and she said, I wear that with pride. I'm there to open the door and make sure more women come after me. And I know a lot of senior women who've said exactly the same thing. And my point about quotas, targets and so on, they're stepping stones to change. They're not there for the good. They're a circuit breaker, and they're actually there to be made redundant at some point when it's no longer needed. Sadly, a long way off, I suspect, but I think that they're very useful. They do that circuit breaking rather well.
Agree with you there. Teresa, do you want to switch tack again, and then we might open up to broader questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jen. Catherine, just from the philosophical to the practical, your sort of thesis, which is set out in Stop Fixing Women, which resonates a lot personally with me, and I know with a number of my colleagues, is sort of one of a number of theories that have been, or a number of approaches that women commentators and others have taken over a number of years. I suppose trying to put a finger on what it is that we can do practically in order to engender and promote gender equality and change. There's the sort of, leaning in, Annabelle Crabb's wife drought, and various other approaches. But one of the things I think that your work really focuses on, and seems to me to raise a particularly important question, is this sort of contrast between the approach of fixing women, or women being told that they have to, be more confident, take more leadership lessons, back themselves, negotiate the same way men do, fix themselves, and the conundrum of a system which is constructed in a way which perhaps doesn't value the skills that women do have. And I know you've said before in some of your writing that you've not yet met a woman who's not confident in her abilities, and I would say the same in my profession. I'm surrounded by amazing, strong, confident women, but nonetheless, there's still a systemic issue at play when comparisons are made between sort of male and female candidates. So, as I said, from the philosophical to the practical, what is your practical advice for women, a number of the women on this call too, at the start of their careers, for how it is that they deal with those issues when, workplaces haven't quite shifted and there is still this transition period that we're going through? How do women advocate for themselves in the sort of context of wanting to support the stop fixing me approach to things when there is still so much uncertainty about what that means?
Okay, well, to start with, I think that, and this is something I luckily hear from all my daughters and their peers, do your due diligence, in fact, even and in particular at the beginning of your careers. Look into the organisation that if you're lucky enough to have an option of a job, but also do your research, because there's some really good data around. Have a look, but also just look at the senior ranks of an organisation. How many women are there? How many people from diverse cultural backgrounds? What's the mix? Are they actually living up to a lot of the rhetoric? There's virtually not an employer today that wouldn't say that they're diverse and they believe in diversity and meritocracy. Don't start me on merit. Which is a highly subjective concept, of course, but we also, I would say to them, really do some of that homework. But the other thing I would say, particularly when you're starting out in your career, find your allies. They'll be there. If you're a grad, my daughter has just finished her graduate year with a law firm. You will find you will have people, other women, but actually men as well. And just make sure that when those issues do arise, or you want to bring something up, that you've got a cohort that you can bring those issues up with. It's a big learning, but I think when you do it on your own, you can sometimes be very vulnerable. The other thing, though, I'd say on the positive side is there are some pretty good policies these days and more awareness of some of these issues. As I say, they're not sort of we're not seeing the impact I would have liked to have seen, but I do think that you have more latitude now to raise them and be at least taken seriously in your concerns. So I think, but feeding that back in a way that doesn't leave you vulnerable is important. But on confidence, can I just come back to that for a moment, because it gets me very annoyed. I was at an event last Friday morning with over 100 young women students from the big universities in Sydney. They're all studying finance, applied finance, actuarial economics. And they run this IWD breakfast every year, and I moderate the panel. And we had one man on the panel who immediately, after he'd introduced himself, started talking about how women lack confidence. Now, what I think often happens here, which I thought was really unfortunate, because the data we have in Australia, by the way, shows that's not the case. Up until their kind of mid-20s, men and women in this country have very similar levels on a research basis. So what we're often doing is confusing symptoms here with cause. So this is presented as, what a shame, you didn't get born with the confidence chip. If you'd only had that, everything would have been fine. Well, no, and that's what annoyed me about Lean In. Actually, assertive women get penalised all the time. It's still the case. We don't like bolshy women, never have. Oh gosh, we beat them up. Look at what happened to our first woman Prime Minister. It's kind of a no-win. And while that's shifting a little bit, it just irks me that we continue to tell women it's your fault. What a shame. If you'd only lent in at that point, your career and, in brackets, systemic sexism would have melted away and everything would have been fine, which just doesn't make sense. It also doesn't make sense to blame a group that is marginalised for their marginalisation. We're not the ones making decisions on the whole. Men are so much more likely to be in leadership in this country and far less likely to be overlooked for promotion. And we know that. So the confidence issue, and the other part of it, what's the gold standard of confidence? Is it alpha male behaviour, which doesn't apply to a lot of men? So I just want to add that. There are a lot of men who don't behave like that, who are also quite assured about what their skills and experience give to them. So I think we've got to be careful about that, and also understand it's cultural. A friend of mine is Korean Australian, and she said she watched a presentation by the biggest funds managers in Korea recently, and the one who's at Samsung was saying, the first thing I have to say to you is I am not worthy to be here, because you have to be humble to be a good leader in Korea. So we look at what is actually a gold standard predicated on white, very stereotypical masculine characteristics. And the final thing about confidence, while I'm on a roll, the overlap between confidence and competence is tiny.
Yeah.
Yeah, you heard me right. The people who are super confident, they are not the ones who are the most competent. So just kind of remember that. So again, I would say to women, when you don't speak up in a meeting or whatever, and someone says to you, Adam, what a shame, I understand exactly why you're not doing that. I was the same. That's because you're savvy and you've understood the politics around the table. How we change that, of course, is to have more women around the table, and whatever we can do to shift that. But I don't demand that women suddenly shape up and take on a burden that, frankly, their male peers don't have to take on. It's unfair.
I agree. And one of the things that I took away from some of your writing, which is something that I've seen a lot in my own sort of working career, and I'm lucky to work with some pretty amazing women, is backing each other in meetings. You know, making sure that if somebody asks a question, it's answered or second or not marginalised by by others who may have different agendas. That seems to me to be a very practical piece of advice. It's
called amplification, actually, Teresa. And men make wonderful amplifiers of women. So the men who are in a meeting and say, could you just let Teresa finish what she was saying, or that was a terrific point that Teresa made, or when we're putting that team together to work on that project, Jen's fantastic at that. Should we bring her? Men can be wonderful amplifiers, but you're absolutely right, women amplifying each other. And in fact, it was a group of women in the early days of the first Obama administration, who came up with that, because even in those days, women were left out. And over time, their male colleagues understood what was going on and took the point. And I think you're right, it's really effective.
Yes. Look, I'm really conscious of time, and I know I've had a couple of questions and comments already come in on the chat. So I'd like to open it up to questions and comments now. If I can kick off with one question that's been sent to me from Lauren Short. Lauren, did you want to ask that question of Catherine directly?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, just in relation to returning to work from parental leave, there's often still an insistence on returning to full-time, even though caregiving is generally, not all the time, the responsibility of the woman. Do you have any advice for change? Because I can see how this results in women stepping back from roles just purely because, obviously, your children will take priority. So,
I'm sorry to hear that's still the case. It was certainly the case when I returned after having my first child. In fact, my editor-in-chief said, you either come back full-time or you're gone. So in those days, it was pretty clear. And I went back full-time for a few months. And then there was always a revolving door at the top of newspapers. So things changed, and I did actually get to work flexibly. But goodness, this is one of the examples of where we think that we've had a battle and we've made some changes, and then we ricochet back. And I think that that's compounded, of course, by what's happened over the last year and the pandemic. There is that sense that, look, if you can't work full-time, there's a bloke there who's supporting a family. So, hey, let's look at priorities here. So that's where we go back to those very old-fashioned stereotypes. I think that has to be challenged. And I think that has to be challenged for women and men. If we're ever going to shift this, it means men are able to take parenting leave, are able to work flexibly. That was actually Annabelle Crabb's point. This can't be all foisted onto one part of a duo if that's how you're living. It has to be shared, and it can be shared. But what we do in this country, and we have a very deeply embedded primary breadwinner model here, very much, that we have to shift that. So I guess my practical advice would be to really look at the policies that are on the books at your employers and actually try and negotiate that, because you do have some leverage. Again, why you have to go to all this effort when we would have thought that we'd moved on to a different regime, it seems to me bitterly disappointing. However, you do have a platform to raise that and to negotiate that. And by the way, you can negotiate just as well as the man next to you. That's another furphy. So I think use whatever of the structure that you're in allows you to set that up. And also not allowing that, gosh, if people found out that an employer was actually, deliberately stymieing women who are trying to reattach to the workforce, wouldn't look very good in the media. That's all I'm saying. Just, keep that in mind.
Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Emma McPhee, I can see you have your hand up. Can I throw over to you to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. First, I'd like to say a big thanks to Catherine for speaking with us today. It's been a real pleasure to hear from you. You've noted that people with the best chance of breaking up the boys' club are the boys, and it's not an issue of fixing women. Yet I can't help but notice at events like this that there's always far less men present than there are women. And the point that you raised about young men becoming more conservative is also quite alarming. And it seems that gender equity is still seen as a women's issue that women are responsible for. How can we encourage this to change?
Yes, it's not an easy one. And I sort of long ago tried to give up angsting about the fact that events like this were all, because I actually look at them and I think, goodness, we need our moments, don't we, to come together and reinvigorate each other, because all of this is freaking exhausting. And this onus that is on our shoulders to fly the flag for our gender all the time. As I say, it doesn't happen to men. And we also hold women, of course, up to higher standards. So when they're not seen to be, you know, as collegiate as we would like them to be, we beat them up. So we're you know, as a society, I should add. I think that what I've noticed is just on a practical level, some organisations have put, you know, progress on diversity on KPIs, for example, and then you'll find, my goodness, and men, quite senior men, can suddenly become a little more interested. I think that sometimes we have to actually have those kinds of checks and balances, otherwise you won't get it. The other thing that I should have probably added about younger men being more conservative, I remember the words of the wonderful feminist Anne Summers many years ago, and she said, sometimes, of course, when you are pushing for change and there's starting to be a little bit of attention, you will find more of a backlash. And I mean, that's a really common experience. So when I looked at those figures with younger men, I wasn't totally surprised, but I also think, goodness, that's because there's a feeling, unfortunately, on behalf of some of those young men, I suspect, of fear. Is somebody going to take something off me? And I think that that is often a predictable phase that we go through. In terms of involving men in the discussion, I think that discussion we just had about amplification, I think giving men, and I'm not saying pandering to them, because I think it's an important message for women as well, but also giving them some of the tools that they can intervene with. Michael Flood, who's a wonderful academic in this area from QUT, he always says that the penalties for men stepping up next to women and being overt about it are quite phenomenal as well. And I understand what he's saying. He's not using that as an excuse, but he is saying we have very strong sort of masculine stereotypes in Australia. And if a man actually does speak up for men, so what's the matter with you, mate? So you do have to, I think we do, we can provide also some encouragement because I think, in fact, there are more empathetic men in our workplaces than possibly they feel able to show us. And I think that that's an important thing to remember as well. So no absolute solutions. The only other thing I'd add, though, is some years ago when I was writing Stop Fixing Women, I spoke to the CEO of Horizon, Lance Hockridge at the time. He went out of his way to change the dynamics in a very male-dominated business. And one of the things he did was set up what he called a Champions of Change internal group. He said, and I think he called them rough diamonds, Catherine. He said, these are blokes who'd been in the business room. And he said, yes, I did have to make it mandatory, but he made them sit down and discuss issues and ways of addressing gender unfairness. And they came up with some extraordinary ideas. And one of the things they did, in fact, and I don't know it was necessarily from that group, but when they did their next apprentice intake, they made it entirely women. So they made some really tangible changes. They also initiated a scheme, which I thought was brilliant, called What Do You Mean By That? Because we know that a lot of this is about casual sexism as well. And he said it gave permission to people to call out, you know, that kind of just joking regime. And he said that was also, and that was from these blokes. So sometimes I do think you have to be intentional and actually involve men in these discussions, mandatory. But once they're on board, his opinion was, once they're on board, they became quite enthusiastic about it. Make them part of the solution, in other words.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Catherine, I'm conscious that we're we're running a little bit over time now. It's been a fantastic discussion. Is there anyone who would like to ask one last question if we have some time? No? Okay. Well, that's been an amazing discussion. So Catherine and Jill from Jen and I and the whole ABL team, thank you so much for your participation in this session today. It's certainly been an amazing discussion with lots of food for thought in what's been, a really challenging time with lots of issues. But also for me, listening to the discussion and the questions that have been asked and the issues we've been addressing also cause for optimism and hope. And, I think from an International Women's Day perspective, it must be a balance of the two, striving, continue to change, but with some hope that change will come despite the setbacks that may be present.
Teresa, sorry, just to jump in there.
No.
Woman interrupting woman, unheard of.
Go with that.
Say, because we talk about this all the time and there's not enough men on the, and I get that. Can I just thank everyone on the call, all the women and the men, but particularly you, because of the time that you commit to this. Thank you. Thank you, every single one of you, for everything you do every day, for the time you spend thinking about it, to your literacy about these issues. Can I tell you, I speak to lots of audiences and women are just extraordinary. So thank you for doing all of that. It's all on top of your day job and your caring role and everything else. So good on you. And thank you from all of society should be thanking us, of course. But thank you so much.
And can I just add too, if I can send you all off to look at Australians investing in women. I was just as a quick aside, I was at the Adelaide Fringe Festival. I was so fortunate to travel on the weekend, but one of the shows that I saw was Best of Ladies Night. And it was basically women who were investing in Australian women artists who otherwise would have been unemployed through COVID. And I think that general thrust that Jill spoke of and that Catherine spoke of, that is about investing in women, whether it be personally or philanthropically or just that gender lens that you can look through, is such an important takeaway from today. So thank you.